I wish to extend the warmest greetings of the rector of this university, Professor Rosario Rizzuto, to the distinguished colleagues, to our guests and students, the organizers of these 2 full days of exchange, and everyone present today and tomorrow. The rector wishes us all a profitable and enlightening meeting. I would like to congratulate Marco Mascia and the Human Rights Center of this university on putting together such a stimulating program, which includes, I'm told, the participation of 35 experts from universities and research centers around Europe, and 6 panels on urgent themes, such as, I read on the program, right? Genocide, ecocide, minority protections, social justice and public health, applying a human rights-based approach to human rights research, bringing home human rights, that is, research at a local level, interculturality and human rights, and women's rights and scientific research. I'm sure the conference will contribute to a better understanding of the potentialities of human rights research in relation to the many challenges of our changing societies now and in the future. We do believe that this university, as our own place of knowledge and ethical living, is a crucial reference point for providing ideas, critical thinking, and research to the cause of defending and implementing human rights at a moment when, apparently, they are increasingly questioned. We are particularly proud to host this event because freedom has been at the very foundation of our history and has supported our mission as an independent place of learning over the 8 centuries of its existence. The university was founded in 1222, and Padua has since promoted freedom in teaching and research, even when that was not a given in other parts of Italy or Europe. In the 16th century, for example, the Pope in Rome required an act of submission to the Catholic faith to all academics in all universities in Italy, and Padua still, against the Pope's will, admitted and welcomed students and professors of all religions, including Orthodox Christians, Protestants, Jews, and so on. In the 17th century, it allowed Galileo's scientific experiments to be carried out here by protecting him from the control of the Vatican in Rome. And personally, I'm extremely proud of working in a university and for a university which has a motto which is Universa Universis Patavina Libertas, which means that Padua's freedom is universal and for all. And all included women from a very early time, because in 1678 we graduated the first woman academic in philosophy, a noble woman from Venice called Elena Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopia. So this major event, the first ever in the history of Western academia, has marked a turning point in our long-standing tradition of freedom. We still see it as part of a continuing effort to keep fundamental liberties and women's rights alive in the university and in society as a whole. Closer to our time, to us in time, Padua was one of the first universities in Europe to establish a research center on human rights, which this year celebrates the 35th anniversary of its foundation in 1992. 35 years of excellent work is quite an achievement, and I think we may consider this conference as a celebration, a kind of birthday party. Therefore, I invite you to join me in wishing the Human Rights Center a very happy birthday. of the many achievements of the Centre and its engagement with the European Commission and other European universities on specific actions, you will probably hear from Marco Mascia soon. I'm sure you're acquainted with the important national and international network established by the Centre, which is part of the global UNESCO chairs system, hosting a chair in human rights, democracy, and peace. And it also offers a complete curriculum in human rights studies, as well as an international doctoral program in human rights, society, and multi-level governance. Really, all of this is a grand effort, a huge commitment, and a visionary plan for which I sincerely thank you. Over the last year, the Human Rights Centre has been an important reference point for many of the activities we have promoted in the university in order to implement human rights as universal values that celebrate diversity and to make the life of all who are part of our own academic community better and more sustainable. I am referring to the many actions concerning the right to education for all, the actions for inclusion of people with disabilities, of young migrants and asylum seekers from the south of the world, and also to the devising of specific actions that address the still large gender gap in academic careers for women. In all of this, we have counted and can count on the quality of the work carried out at the Centre and its constant pushing against what limits the right of all to a full, free and dignified life. This is quite invaluable. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today. Let me just conclude by wishing you an inspiring conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalisa, also for your word. Vice rectors, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca, and the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights, Democracy and Peace of the University of Padua, I have the honor and the great pleasure to warmly welcome each of you to the International Conference on the Rule of Human Rights Research, Current Challenges and Future Opportunities. I'm especially grateful to the keynote speakers, Professor Todd Landman, Linda Hogan, Kunde Feiter, David McCoy, and to Dr. Anna Neistat of Amnesty International, to Wolfgang Heinz of the German Institute of Human Rights, and to Dr. Antoine Meyer, a Masterone of the French National Asylum Court. A special thanks to the institutes that have cooperated in the organization and management of conferences and research panels. Human Rights Consortium, University of London, School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg, European Training Center for Human Rights and Democracy, and UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Human Security, University of Graz, UNESCO Chair Women Health Rights, Ibn Tufayl University in Morocco, and Institute des Droits de l'Homme, Lyon Catholic University. My deepest gratitude to the University of Padua, in particular to Vice Rectors Annalisa Oboe and Marcella Bonchio, and to Elena Pariotti, Professor of Human Rights and Director of the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies, for their constant and convincing support. The conference is promoting the framework of the celebration, as Annalisa said, for the 35th anniversary of the establishment of the University of Padua Human Rights Center, in cooperation with the Bachelor Degree Program in Political Science, International Relations, Human Rights, the Master Degree Program in Human Rights and Multilevel Governance, and the Joint International PhD Program in Human Rights, Society and Multilevel Governance. I am pleased to inform you that with the decree of the Magnificent Rector of 2 November 2017, the Human Rights Center was named after its founder, Professor Antonio Papisca, was passed on May 16 this year. I express my gratitude to the governing body of my university, especially to the rector, Professor Rosario Rizzuto. Antonio Papisca's life was an open building site of ideas and projects, a continuous stimulus to reflection and dialogue, a constant invitation to action. In this room, there are two colleagues, two masters of political sciences and human rights, Todd Landman and Kunde Feiter, who have collaborated with Antonio from the very beginning towards the realization of the fully humanist adventure, which is the European Master in Human Rights and Democratization, the cornerstone of the Venice-based global campus of Human Rights Master, a major project of European Union now involving 40 universities in Europe and many others worldwide. And heartfelt thanks to Todd and Kun for being here today with us. Let me add just a few words about the conference that is now inaugurating. 69 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration, human rights values are today under attack, more intensely than at any period in recent decades. Violence, wars, terrorism, rearmament, autocracy and dictatorial tendencies are increasingly shaking the human condition in the grip of insecurity. The universal and the regional human rights protection systems, together with the multilateral institutions within which they operate, are overloaded of inputs, while states do not provide the necessary resources to support and strengthen them. The human rights machinery, both at local and national level, has been one of the first sectors to be negatively affected by cuts resulting from the economic crisis. Attacks against the human rights defender are a global emergency. The most up-to-date data of the report Global Witness show that 2017 is going to be bloodiest year for the number of killings of land and environment defenders, being more than 150. The cases already registered up to late October. According to the data collected by Michel Faust, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights defenders, at least 450 attacks have been documented in 2015-2016. Antonio Papisca said that war as an instrument and an institution of death is bad, like cancer. And he argued that the political scientist must help to understand how to exceed the belligerent structure of the international system as the medical scientists help to eradicate cancer. Otherwise, the international political scholar cannot simply make the chronicler or notary of criminal events or behaviors. If war and exploitation are evil because they destroy the life and inflict suffering on human beings, and if peace is good because it is the premise and guarantee of life, the deontology of the international relations scholars cannot be different from that of the oncologist. So, this international conference aimed to delve into the various facets of this debate, which is crucial for the present and future of human rights, with the goal of providing an original contribution to discuss the role of human rights research and improve its policy and action-oriented effectiveness. The conference also aimed at strengthening networking and cooperation among research centers committed to these themes worldwide. This plenary session opened the debate about the challenges the different disciplinary approaches and methodologies bring to human rights research and about the advantages and limits of their possible correlation and interconnections. This will be facilitated through keynote speeches delivered by internationally renowned human rights scholars Todd Landman, Linda Hogan, and Kunde Feiter. The plenary session will be followed with a series of parallel research panels on topics concerning challenges to human rights research. The topics have been identified in consultation with the Human Rights Center and institution that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this welcome address, have joined the Padua Center and organized the conference. The panels will be animated by 32 scholars, researchers, and doctoral students selected on the basis of a call for papers. Thanks for the scientific contribution that each of you will give to our conference. The task of the closed plenary session is to unearth and discuss the challenges and opportunities of human rights research from different non-academic perspectives, with special reference to non-governmental organizations and national human rights institutions. The closing keynote speech will be held by Professor David McCoy with a very challenging title, Riding Two Horses, the Challenges of Conducting Academic Research while also engaging politically. So I conclude. On November 16 this year, at the Human Rights Center of the University of Padua, PhD candidates and professors of the International Joint PhD Program on Human Rights had the great gift to meet the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize, Madame Lehman Bowie from Liberia. In her speech, Madame Bowie stressed the importance of the cooperation between the academia and the human rights activism for the purpose of building lasting, sustainable, and inclusive peace. These two areas have worked for too long in silence and separately. The time has come to link research with civil society. The aim is to find a common strategy to shape a world where all human rights are interrelated and intertwined on multiple levels. Activism helps the academia to translate research into real change at the local level. Acknowledging the 35 years experience in human rights research of the Human Rights Center of the University of Padua, Lehman Bowie made a call for the next 35 years. She hoped for a research that is accessible, youth and children friendly, a research which earnest activism and is aimed at educating. Indeed, for human rights to be taught and learned from early childhood, researchers need to be in close contact with communities, merging with them, with the territory and with its specific problems. In Lehman Bowie's vision, human rights centers worldwide will become a space where the new generation of human rights research and activists will grow. Having shared this hope with all of you, I'm now pleased to give the floor to Professor Giuseppe Jordan, coordinator of the International Joint PhD Program in Human Rights Society and Multi-Level Governance. Thank you for your attention.
Dear colleagues, dear students, it's a true pleasure for me to welcome you to this international conference in which we have the opportunity to rethink the role of human rights research and discuss current weaknesses and strengths of both human rights policies and scholarship. We do this in a time characterized by a decrease of trust, or if you prefer, a decrease of faith in human rights principles. It's of crucial importance for us today to readdress the current moment of disenchantment in human rights ideas with solid theoretical perspectives and new research methods. Human rights scholarship and research-based education have an important role in articulating and drawing public attention to the disregard for human rights. Human rights theory with its critical analysis of human rights conditions, gives us well-established approaches which remind us that the right to have rights is a robust precondition for human rights advancement. Even though historians do not like to make historical parallels, we could make a comparison between the current global migration flows and the refugee crisis on one hand, with the post-World War II situation. Theoretical discourses of the last century still remind us that exclusion from political community, as well as weakness of citizenship rights, could harm the very idea of human rights. There are many explanations of the process of disenchantment in human rights that are out of our reach. But at the same time, we recognize that university research could make a difference in rebuilding trust and confidence in this sphere. In regard to this, I would like to draw your attention on the bilateral relationship between research and human rights policy. Emphasizing the role of research in our conference theme, we are aware that the origin of human rights research could be found in the drafting processes in international treaties and declarations, as well as the following monitoring procedures. At the same time, special procedures of Human Rights Council, human rights organizations, and NGOs produced their own type of research, which is related to reporting analysis of policy papers and gaps between policy and practice. What kind of research can university-based human rights centers suggest from this perspective? I can briefly tell you what we are trying to do in our newborn PhD program in human rights, society, and multi-level governance here at the University of Padua. What we are trying to do is to provide space for discussion between human rights practice and theory, moving forward with the following perspectives and methods. Interdisciplinary studies, bringing together different approaches from a variety of disciplines. Research on new areas of human rights application, which includes academic research of intersecting rights, new social problems, and human rights tensions. Cross-national comparative studies on specific rights. Theoretical perspectives and critical analysis of human rights violations or implementations. Building up special university programs, educating young people and equipping them with a special sensibility towards human rights issues. Implementing a stronger cooperation of human rights scholars with policymakers and public administrators. Strengthening the human rights leadership with scholarship approach. As a new PhD program, we face the issue that research on human rights requires specialists who could integrate in their professional qualities both human rights scholarship and skill for human rights advocacy. Which is why we implement in our program interdisciplinary research-based approaches in law, international relations, political studies, economics, sociology, anthropology, and philosophy. We look forward to listening to your contributions in this unique conference to reflect on theoretical discourses and methodologies of human rights analysis, as well as the best practices of human rights education. As the coordinator of the International Joint PhD on Human Rights, Society and Multi-Level Governance based at the Padua University Human Rights Center, I would like to thank my colleagues who organized this important scientific event. Our PhD students, as well as many of their supervisors, are present here and have the possibility to discuss with all of you. I do hope that this conference is just the beginning of a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Professor Marcella Bonchio, Vice Rector for Research. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I have the honor and the privilege to coordinate the research strategies at the University of Padua. And I'm really proud to tell you that the University of Padua got the first ranking position in the national evaluation of research activities among the big university. Because Padua is a huge university, we have more than 62,000 students, and we have 32 departments, research departments, so you can understand we cover all disciplines and all scientific areas. And we got the first place for research on 11 scientific areas out of 16. So here is the place where we can think about new research and new opportunities. And I'm very happy to be here and to participate to the opening of this workshop, symposium, school, and exchange of ideas. Because I want to share with you one fundamental topic, and it's about research. Okay, what does it mean to think about new research in human rights? Okay, so we may just start to think about what is a definition, a good definition for research in our modern times. Okay, so if we look back, not just in advance, but too late, before, but just recently, the definition of research was split in two. You know, we had the academic research, and this was meant mostly like fundamental studies, basic research, and this was different from the applied research. So the research that was actually making an impact in the everyday life, you know? So the fundamental research was about, you know, what kind of water to put to have a good water to make the washing machine run, and the applied research was how to build the washing machine with this, you know, new water, new principle about, you know, good water. Now, and I think we have, you know, the research concept has really evolved, okay, and we have a new definition that is frontier research, okay? With the definition of frontier research, and this is a definition that the European Council has really implemented in their programs, in their granted programs, with frontier research, we have a merging of these two concepts. So, of the fundamental together with the applied research, and means that we aim at a research that can change our life and can make our life better. And of course, we start from the fundamental problems and from the fundamental way of handling research. But then we aim strongly to make an impact in everyday life. Okay? So I think that with this kind of objective, we have to approach this complex problem, okay, as we have heard, about making human life better in a place, in a space where human rights, you know, are, of course, the basis of to make a better life. So, in a scientific way, we should also dissect the problem. Okay, so I really like the approach by Antonio Papisca. So we should work as to fight a cancer, okay? And in doing this, we have to be rigorous. We have to be willing to make an impact. We have to have the strength to go till the very end and to the solution of the problem. So with this kind of spirit, I hope and I'm sure that you will find in these days, the way to trace a new progress. And I'm looking forward to the new ideas. And so with this kind of objective, I wish you a very inspiring conference, and I thank you all for being here in Padua today. Thank you.
Good morning to everybody. For sure, pluralism, religion, development are the core fields of both human rights studies and human rights practices. And they are certainly fields asking for frontier research, as Marcella Bonchio has just said, and they are fields in which frontier research has been doing. So we take today the advantage from the contributions from 3 scholars who have a great expertise and who are the main thing, reference points in these fields. Todd Landman is professor of political science and pro-vice chancellor with responsibility for the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Nottingham. His research has focused on comparative politics and human rights, and on measuring human rights. His publications include a very long list of volumes and contributions on mythos in comparative politics, human rights and democracy, measuring human rights, and so on. Linda Hogan is professor of ecumenics and vice provost of Trinity College of Dublin. Her expertise is in social ethics and human rights, religion and human rights, and biomedical ethics. She also acts as a consultant for a number of national and international organizations focusing on developing ethical infrastructures, which are for sure very important for human rights practices and for human rights constructions. Cohen de Feiter is professor of international law at the University of Antwerp and part-time professor at the University of Maastricht. His main field of research is development and human rights. He has written a very long list of contributions on this very important topic, very important field of research. So I'm very glad and honored to leave the floor to Professor Todd Landman for his speech here today.
Thank you very much, Elena. Green means good. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure to present an introduction on transdisciplinarity in the advance of human rights. And I have to say, it wouldn't really be possible for me to share what I have to share with you today without the presence of this man. Antonio Papisca invited us to set up something brand new here in Europe 20 years ago. And in part of our discussions in the Lido in Venice, I remember him talking about transdisciplinarity. In fact, he wanted to go so far as to talk about a transplanetary approach to human rights. And after you see what I have to present with you today, we're not far off from that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, to get started, what I think is the largest problem of human rights. And I wanted to refer to what Antonio Papisca used, this analogy about the ontology of human rights should be no different than what the oncologist is looking at. But ultimately, what we have is a meta-division and what I call the two worlds of human rights. The first world is the world of the ought, in that human rights law, practice, and philosophy tells us what ought to be achieved in the world, and the is, which is what we do when we research the world and find out precisely what is actually happening. And often there's a massive gap between that which I call the ought and the is. It is a distinction between what we call the normative world and the empirical world. And for the last 30 or so years, I've tried to bring those two worlds together into an approach that I call rigorous morality. So what does something like that look like? Well, first of all, if we think about the different disciplines, there are a number of disciplines dedicated to studying the ought, which is to say they philosophize on a good life, if you will, or what that good life should look like for all of us. So moral philosophy, political philosophy, the philosophy of law, and theology tell us what the world should look like, whether it's in God's image or some secular derivation. It is setting out a set of principles for governing society, thinking about society, and thinking about the human condition in an ideal way. Whereas other disciplines, law, political science, economics, sociology, geography, and the rest of that list, are concerned with looking at the world as how it really is, and hopefully bringing those two worlds closer together, where the reality of what we experience in our lives approaches the ideal set out by philosophers, theologians, etc. So what does rigorous morality look like? I share a figure from a new piece of work I'm working on, and to many of you it might just look like a simple scatter plot between two things. And those things are a measure of democracy on the x-axis and a measure of human rights on the y-axis. And there are all sorts of explanations for how those measures have been derived. But the actual doing this research and engaged in this research is actually taking some ideal concepts like democracy and what that ought to look like, and human rights and what they ought to be practiced and protected, and operationalizing them into quantitative measures. So that conversion between taking an ideal state of things and trying to put some sort of quantitative expression to it is a classic move in social science to give empirical referent to a set of ideal concepts. Now, the work that I've been doing over many, many years is actually trying to challenge the idea of a value-neutral science. And if we go back to what Antonio Papisca said about the oncologist and the political scientist, in many ways, once you commit to the study, empirical study of human rights, you're making a value judgment. You're saying this is an area of work that I want to do because it is good to do, and we are trying to actually find out ways in which the world might advance towards that good. In that sense, it is value-oriented. But equally, when we look out into the world, we see problems that concern us, puzzles and challenges, a variation that needs to be explained. Why is it that human rights are better protected in some countries versus others? And that problem-driven approach in human rights is one that I very much adopt. At the same time, I think there's a place for being empirically rigorous. So again, to echo the words of Professor Papisca, this notion of a scientific study of the gap between the ideal and the reality is important for us all. It tells us where to look for our problems. It also looks at the empirical regularities in the world and allows us to develop models of explanation where policy intervention might make a difference. So in that sense, a rigorous morality approach to social science brings the ought and the is closer together. And that nexus between the ought and the is very much embodied in my empirical study of human rights. What about methods then? At the core of the methods that I've been pursuing over many years is this idea of a link between the evidence that we consider about the world and the inferences that we draw from that evidence. And this idea of inference is very important to me. It is using facts about the world that we know to say something about facts about the world that we do not yet know. And there's an intimate link between the way in which we gather that evidence and then work to find the inferences. And again, if we look back on science, there are basically two approaches. There's the inductive approach to research and the deductive approach to research. So I'll give you just a brief overview of both and then move on to methods and some examples. For me, research design must answer three basic questions. What is it that you want to know? What is it you're setting out to discover? And I challenge all my students with this question. What is your problem that you want to know? How do you define the problem in the research question? Secondly, how are you going to find it out? What sort of methods do you think you're going to adopt? Are you going to be a qualitative researcher, a quantitative researcher? What sorts of things will you look for? And the third question, most importantly, which really tips its hat towards a more positivistic approach, is how would you know if you're wrong? And one of the criticisms I have of the human rights community is it often thinks it's completely right about everything, when in fact it's often quite wrong about many things. And an empirical approach, a scientific approach, allows us to have a set of rules that allow us to judge when it is we think we are correct and when we're wrong. So if we think about hypothesis, null hypothesis, and hypothesis testing direct from science, that actually allows us to have research designs that can tell us when we're wrong. Now, inductive approaches tend to look at the world in terms of the variation to be explained. There's a puzzle, there's something that someone perceives, and immediately that initial observation leads to us to look across different units, whether those are individuals, groups, subnational units, states, or regions. We might have an impulse to measure those things, either in qualitative ways or in quantitative ways. We say something is more or less than something else. We had a reference here about comparative indicators on human rights or comparative study of human rights. So immediately we start making judgments about more or less. And this leads to an induction for why those things might be happening. And in my work on comparative politics, the three bodies of theory, rationalism and realism, structural institutional approaches, and cultural constructive approaches, might give us clues as to why we think things are happening in the world. They might begin to lead to some propositions or observable implications in the world that can then be subjected to testing through comparative methods, whether we compare many countries, few countries, single country studies, or some subnational case studies. The impulse here is to have a series of observable implications that are then tested. The analysis of those countries and the data we use, whether qualitative or quantitative, then lead to explanation of the variation that we saw in the very first case. So there's a perfect loop, if you will, between that which you observe and then you're thinking through the scientific process, which I call research design. Now, deductive people are wired differently, and I have to confess I'm more of an inductivist than I am a deductivist, but I am persuaded by deductive approaches now and again. Certainly my colleagues in the School of Economics would like to persuade me of this. Again, there's variation to be explained, but a deductivist, after making the initial observation, will jump to theory and modeling immediately. So they'll look at a situation in the world and they say, oh, that's a chicken game, or that's a bargaining game, or that's a brinksmanship that someone's playing, or that's a prisoner's dilemma. They will immediately assume certain things about human nature and begin to model in their mind what that ideal relationship is. And that leads to a series of deductive propositions which can then be compared over one or many countries or observations, leads to measurement, and again, using qualitative or quantitative indicators, and then analysis and explanation. Again, there's a perfect feedback loop between the initial observation and explanation for it, but the process, the pathway, if you will, around that journey is slightly different. And the deductive approach really, in terms of research design, begins from that immediate jump from the initial observation to theorizing about why that might be. So what are the trade-offs that we face? In comparative politics and international relations, we face many different methodological trade-offs. On the one hand, there's this notion of the ladder of abstraction, On the other hand, the scope of countries that we compare, from either one country all the way up to however many countries there are in the world at any given time. And of course, that can be over time and space. And the trade-offs we have are the types of things that we might be able to look at in the world. So international relations, comparative politics, and the empirical study of human rights has really grown over the last 30 years, looking at large N quantitative approaches across many countries and time. And of course, the large N quantitative approach gives you large generalizations about global processes and leads to a number of inferences that apply more or less ceteris paribus across many different countries. But they often leave people feeling a little bit unsatisfied. Things like economic development and democracy are positively correlated. Doesn't really get me out of bed in the morning, right? But there are many studies that will tell you that. And for people that are disappointed with large N quantitative approaches may lower their level of abstraction and number of countries considered and look at small N quantitative and qualitative comparison of a few countries and adopt what's popularly known as a most different systems design or a most similar systems design. And equally, people might be dissatisfied even with the comparative method, that to compare is not something that is attractive, that cultures and understandings and values are so very different in the world that actually we need to go back to our sui generis explanations and concentrate on single country studies. And I can't tell you the number of students who have come through my office saying, I want to do a study on Guatemala and human rights. And I say, why do you want to do that? And they say, because it's really bad there. And I say, yeah, but there are many bad places in the world with many bad problems with human rights. Why is it that you want to do this in Guatemala? What is it a case of, for example? So I've always tried to push students into the scientific value of the single case study. But across many of those different research approaches, there are many trade-offs. And I think there's a methodological continuum between these different approaches and that they should talk to one another. What we learn at the global quantitative level can inform things that we learn at the single country level and vice versa. So what about some examples? I want to share two examples with you before I finish. One around human rights compliance and run around a new project at the University of Nottingham on combating modern slavery. In my book in 2005 called Protecting Human Rights, a Comparative Study, I was interested in the relationship between international law, international relations, and comparative politics. And I remember sitting in a session, again, in the Lido in Venice, and Professor Marko Suksi from Åbo Academy in Finland presented some data where he was measuring national constitutions and their protection of human rights. And I thought, well, this is interesting. So he actually quantified constitutions, right? Maybe someone could quantify the international human rights regime by looking at ratification rates of countries, both in terms of how many treaties they ratified or whether they signed and ratified treaties or not, and the degree to which they filed reservations upon ratification. And equally, international relations scholars had always said it's all about realism and power and material capabilities. International law is, all that does is reify existing power relations. The international law does not have an independent effect on state behavior. So those were two big challenges for me. Someone who was measuring constitutions, a lawyer who was measuring constitutions, and scholars who were saying that power was really the one thing to focus on and that law was just an inconvenience, if anything. And then in comparative politics, there was a convergence theoretically. In particular, Mark Lischbach in the United States had tried to bring together rationalist, culturalist, and structuralist approaches and say that they were not diametrically opposed to one another, but there were synergies between them that we as scholars should concentrate on. So this theoretical convergence came together in a study that looked at treaty ratification and state behavior across all the countries in the world over 30 years of time. So I adopted a large N quantitative approach and built a sort of empirical model between feedback loops within international law, because a country who ratifies one treaty has a high probability of ratifying another one, and there's trending that takes place. There's also bandwagon effects within regions and diffusion effects across countries. And equally, human rights protection itself is something that has a feedback loop over time, that the advance of human rights can build incrementally within countries. And there were a number of independent variables I was interested in, and all of this was operationalized quantitatively, and I used standard statistical methods to look at the overall relationships. And what I found is that treaty ratification actually has a significant but limited compliance effect, which is to say that states that ratify human rights treaties, by and large, have better records at protecting human rights, and that the flow, if you will, that relationship tends to be from law to practice rather than practice to law. Because a lot of people said, well, is it just the case that rights-protecting states ratify treaties more often? And it turns out that that's not actually true. So in terms of time lags and the sorts of testing that we did, treaty ratification preceded improvement in rights. But that overall relationship is differentiated by region. So South Asia, the MENA countries, and sub-Saharan Africa, that relationship is a little less, well, they start off from a weaker starting point than the predicted values of the general trend in the world. I also found there was a differentiation across types of democracy, so that the fourth wave, third wave democracies ratified more treaties, but actually were less good at protecting human rights, whereas older democracies ratified fewer treaties with more reservations, but had a better record at protecting human rights. And I think that differentiation was very important. And so technically we call this an intercept shift, because you can see that there are different types of countries across the world in that overall relationship. So with that as a background, at the University of Nottingham, I encountered a community of scholars, a very large community of scholars organized in what's called the Rights and Justice Research Priority Area. And that network had about 18 centers and 800 staff. And I thought, well, that's probably too large for a single project, so we're going to have to focus on something. And the university invited us to apply for what are called beacons of excellence. And over the last year, we have honed 6 main beacons of excellence out of the research base within our university. And the one that I'm intimately involved in, we call the Rights Lab. And the first issue that we're looking at is the problem of modern slavery. So we've built a large-scale, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary anti-slavery research platform. The university has invested about £6.5 million in this project over the next 5 years, with the expectation that we then go out and leverage more public research funding for this project. There are 14 integrated projects, over 125 academics in the university, but also partnerships in the world with NGOs, IGOs, and other partners. Our goal is to help end modern slavery, not end it, but help end it. I think there's a distinction there that needs to be asserted. By 2030, which is also part of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, and we're particularly focused on Sustainable Development Goal 8.7. Our questions are as follows. We're motivated by 4 major research questions, which is how many slaves exist in the world and where are they? Secondly, why does slavery persist? What works to end slavery, and what difference does freedom make? So what, if you were to reduce slavery, what would be the positive benefits accrued to the world of having done that? The methods, or meta-methods, if you will, is that we're very much wedded to the idea of measuring and monitoring the prevalence and variation in modern slavery around the world, to analyze and build models that explain slavery's causes and consequences, to intervene with policy recommendations and research-led anti-slavery pilots around the world, working with our stakeholders, and then to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of strategies and interventions. So there's a very strong empirical drive through all of this, but there are different levels of analysis that we're engaged in, as well as different types of focus. So the intersections across all these 14 projects show that there's an interrelationship between working on the measurement, working on interventions, etc. So these projects on cities and conflict, identity, ecosystems, economics, and migration all intersect with each other. But for the themes of this conference, I thought it would be really good to share with you our notion of transdisciplinarity. On the left-hand side of the figure, you see the faculties involved with this project. So all 5 faculties at the University of Nottingham are intimately involved in this project across the different 14 project teams. So the social sciences dominate. I think about 85% of the projects are grounded in the social sciences, but we have natural science working on MRI scanning of survivors of slavery, for example, and trying to work out whether there's something different that happens to people physiologically if they're engaged in modern slavery, to medical interventions in mental health. How do we work with survivors of slavery, and how do we engage them into reintegrating them to a normal economy? Engineering with geospatial techniques, and the arts, looking at slavery narratives, slavery discourses, and corpus linguistic approaches and sociolinguistic approaches to understanding what slaves say about themselves. Work thus far has included a number of things. We started with our funding on August 1st. We have about £58 million worth of grants pending at the moment. The British government has made a lot of money available in the Global Challenge Fund, for example, working through DFID and other partners. and academics. One of the projects we engaged in was this idea of slavery from space, and this has manifested itself in two ways, and it seems to me this is the sort of thing Antonio Papisca would have loved. So we're using satellites to identify slavery sites around the world. And this particular picture is from Bangladesh, and what you see on the left is actually not buildings or houses. That should not be there because this is a World Heritage Site protected by UNESCO and should not be developed on. And two, those are actually fishing drying racks used in the fishing industry. And ground sourcing information, once this picture was identified, revealed to us that the children employed in this, age between 9 and 14, are being enslaved and beaten to work on the fishing drying racks for the fish industry. So something that we can see from space can be verified from the ground level, and then we can use that information to advocate for change. One of the other projects in Slavery from Space is a Zooniverse project online, where we show thousands of images of brick kilns across India and Pakistan and Nepal, and ask users to see whether they can correctly identify those sites as brick kilns or not. And then that feeds into a machine learning algorithm that will allow us to look at thousands of images around the world and try to maximize our ability to identify possible sites of slavery. Second piece of work, we're in partnership with the Walk Free Foundation, which is funded by the Minderoo Foundation in Australia. And they produced the Global Slavery Index, which is a prevalence estimate. They're now working in partnership with the International Labor Organization, and the current estimate of slaves, as they define them, are 40.3 million in the world. It's the largest raw number of slaves that have ever been in existence in world history, but as a proportion of global population, it's still very, very small. At the ground level in Nottingham, we have a project that's committed to making Nottingham a slavery-free city. And it turns out that proposition itself is challenging from a multidisciplinary perspective. How do you make a city slavery-free? How do you intervene across the economy, polity, governance, police, and outlying areas to make Nottingham a slavery-free city? One of the simple manifestations that we've seen are the use of car washes on the periphery of cities in the UK. You can get your car washed for £6 and 30 minutes with 6 people washing your car. Simple math tells you that those people are not being paid the basic minimum wage, right? If you model that across the UK, you can work out how many people are potentially in unfair labor practices. Estimates within the UK suggest there are between 13 and 15,000 slaves currently in the UK, and in 2015, Tereza May had a bill go through Parliament called the Modern Slavery Act, which requires companies of over £36 million turnover to have slavery statements and to fight slavery in their supply chains as a legal obligation. Our work in Nottingham is partnered with the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Kevin Highland, and we've done a new piece of work on all the different anti-slavery partnerships across the UK. So that map is the sort of degree to which different groups are working together and the density of those networks within the UK. So we see the Welsh approach is actually one of the densest and most collaborative approach to fighting slavery, but there are disparate groups working to fight slavery across the UK. So those two projects, in a way, the two examples are illustrations of how we can bring different disciplines together, all the way from the social sciences up to the natural sciences and engineering, to focus on particular human rights problems. If you're interested in any of this, the final thing I would share is we have a podcast called The Rights Track, which is on iTunes, and it's completely free. Series 1 had 12 podcasts with academics working on human rights. Series 2, 12 podcasts of practitioners struggling for human rights. And Series 3 is dedicated to the slavery issue. We had 2 podcasts already. One is being released this Friday for Anti-Slavery Day on the 2nd of December. And you can find that at rightstrack.org. We'd encourage everyone to participate as much as you can. So in closing, it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to share my thoughts with you today. Inspired by Professor Papisca those many years ago, I've gone off and just sort of run with it, and I think that the sorts of things that are available to us now in terms of technology, methodologies, digital platforms, etc., it's one of the most exciting times to be doing human rights research, and I hope that what I had to share with you today has provided a degree of stimulation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Todd Landman for having drawn our attention on some very fundamental issues related to the relationship between ought and is in human rights studies, and for having provided us with some good examples of this kind of research and inquiry. And now the floor to Professor Linda Hogan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure, and I really enjoyed Professor Laman's comments. I hope that my paper this morning will complement that to some extent. I think I'm speaking in the world of the ought rather than the world of the is, but hopefully we'll have some interesting conversations. I also, at the outset, would like to say that I offer my reflections today as one who supports the concept that this conference is promoting, namely that human rights research really has the potential to have a positive impact on the implementation of human rights. So in my case, I am interested in whether and how citizens worldwide can go about the task of building a shared political life underpinned by a commitment to human rights, and what role religions can play in the articulation of this profoundly ethical commitment. So in this paper, I will discuss, first of all, why I think it's possible to keep faith with human rights and on what basis, and then also to how I think religious traditions can play a positive and dynamic role in the articulation of this vision of public good, global public good. However, I will enter a caveat in relation to each of these. First, I shall argue that it's important that human rights is not conceptualized in an essentialized, idealized universalist discourse, and that it's not regarded as the exclusive property of any single philosophical or metaphysical worldview, because I will suggest that the key to its ongoing and future success is that it has allowed for, drawn strength from, incorporated and appropriated a plurality of philosophical and religious and cultural worldviews and moral languages. And additionally, I will advocate endorsing an approach to religion that draws on more than a century of criticism, particularly feminist and post-colonial criticism. And in this approach, I want to stress the discursive and evolutionary nature of religion, highlight its internal diversity and its contestation. So this approach recognizes that repressive and authoritarian forms of religions exist, but also that they continue to be challenged from within. So in effect, I think I'm trying to rethink with a number of other scholars the nature of rights, and concurrently to revalorize the role of religion, but critical religion, not forms of religion that are blind to or silent about their own constructedness. So let me say something by way of introduction about why religion has an important role in this context, although perhaps this is something that would be accepted in this environment. We know that we live in an age of religious revival and political religion, and this is the political context in which human rights have to be championed and secured. The recently published report on the future of world religions, Population Growth Projections 2010 to 2060, by the Pew Research Center, suggests not only that the decline in religious affiliation has been halted, but also that religion will continue to be an important political phenomenon for decades to come. The report projects how the global religious landscape will look by 2060 if current trends in demographics continue, including incorporating patterns of religious switching and exit and migration. And it shows that those with a religious affiliation will continue to make up an increasing share of the world's population. Atheists, agnostics, and other people who do not affiliate with any religion will continue to make up a declining share of the world's population, from the current 16% in 2015 to the likely 10% in 2060. So religion, it seems, is here to stay, and its impact on political life is likely to persist in multiple forms and fora. So really, I suppose I'm highlighting that currently about 85% of the world's population affiliate with religious traditions. So if we are really serious about human rights implementation, it's vital that we continue to engage with religious traditions who have a tremendous impact, not only in terms of the education of children, but also in terms of concepts of family, gender relationships, etc. But the trajectory is a complex one, and it's not really adequately captured through the simple categories of religiosity and secularism, because the 2014 Pew Report on Global Religious Diversity also suggests that religious diversity within and across countries is also an extremely important feature of the global religious and political landscape. So the growing strength of religious traditions, combined with the diverse nature of the presence of religion, is an important factor as we think about human rights and the role that religions and other worldviews can play in their advancement. Of course, human beings have always lived in the midst of diversity, religious, moral, and political. Nonetheless, as Charles Taylor's Secular Age highlights, and as the Pew data suggests, what is distinctive about contemporary pluralism is that it's not just one factor amongst others, but rather it is the determinative factor of our age. Moreover, as Martha Nussbaum argues in her New Religious Intolerance, since 9/11, the politics of fear has threatened to undermine the toleration that has been achieved in many parts of the world, and to further inflame cultural and religious disagreements where discord already exists. So the plural character of the presence of religion has a profound impact on politics, and inevitably on debates about the nature, content, significance, and universality of human rights. No less significant, however, is what Jose Casanova has described as the deprivatization of religion, and the related phenomenon of the repoliticization of the private religious sphere, each of which has accelerated in the last 2 decades, and the impact of which has been felt across the globe. Thus, religious believers, like other citizens, expect to express their views on matters of critical public interest within the accepted deliberative processes of the polis. They also often expect the religious institutions to which they belong to play a role in influencing public policy on issues of ethical, social, and political significance. Moreover, the issues of greatest concern to citizens, whether they belong to religious traditions or not, and on which they seek to influence policy decisions, are often those that are construed as belonging to the private religious and moral sphere. But this distinction, I think, is unhelpful as it relates to the political manifestation of religions, since when one considers the pivotal issues on which these debates about political influence of religion revolve, one can see that few issues are more obviously simultaneously political and private than fundamental human rights: the right to health care, a living wage, bodily integrity, gender equality. So it's inevitable that citizens motivated by different religious and philosophical worldviews will forward a diversity of perspectives on the values by which individuals ought to live their lives, on the nature of the human goods by which a society ought to order itself, and on the substantive rights to which all human beings are entitled. Moreover, given the likely incommensurability not only of some of these conceptualizations of the good, but also on the substantive rights to which human beings are entitled, one must ask how and whether a durable politics of human rights can be built amongst people with such diverse religious and philosophical commitments. So given the global significance of religion and given the inescapably political nature of religion, I propose an approach to human rights politics in which religious and other comprehensive doctrines are recognized as having a significant role to play, in which the public square is acknowledged as a multi-religious and pluralistic square, not a neutral one, and in which religious traditions can play an important role in the creation of a shared commitment to fundamental human rights by generating and promoting a multi-religious, cross-cultural conversation on the ethical values that should ground our lives. So let me say something then about how I conceptualize and understand human rights. I think nothing captures the ambiguity of human rights more acutely than its claim to universality. It's both the basis of its potency and also the condition of its vulnerability. Its claim to be grounded in universal values that are underpinned by an objective moral order is deeply embedded in the legacy of its philosophical origins, obviously. Yet notwithstanding its philosophical heritage, this claim, I think, is belied by the nature of the political contestation that has accompanied its development. In fact, human rights discourse has had a complicated history with contradictory impulses. So politically, human rights discourse can be interpreted as either being relentlessly Western or understood as an evolving language of shared value. Philosophically, it can be regarded either as a discourse of Enlightenment universalism or, as it has occasionally been termed, as an insurrectionary praxis, while theologically it can be understood to be necessarily grounded in a theistic framework, or it can be read, in Francesca Klug's phrase, as the language of values for a godless age. In each case, the claim to universality is significant in relation to the way in which these debates have evolved. Moreover, it's often the decisive factor as advocates and critics marshal their respective arguments, either in support of or against the politics of human rights. In many respects, one might conclude that human rights discourse has entered a cul-de-sac, with universalists and relativists each defending opposite sides of the same epistemological model, without ever any hope of rapprochement. Now, I wish to take a step back and ask what kind of universality is appropriate and necessary for the politics of human rights today. This, I suggest, is a critical question that tends to be overlooked as advocates and critics do battle over the putative universality of human rights. I wish to defend a form of universalism, but one that is recalibrated to take account of what we've come to understand about the nature of moral knowledge and its apprehension. The form of universalism I defend, therefore, is not grounded in one single philosophical or theological framework, is not discerned through a form of decontextualized or abstract reasoning, is not oriented towards the development of a neutral normative regime, and does not expect disputes over particular human rights to be resolved through declarations of their universality. The form of universalism I defend, rather, is grounded in the conviction that all of our knowledge of the world is situated, that the universalist convictions that we articulate are inevitably embedded in the cultural values through which they're expressed, that the justifications we marshal are contingent on the frameworks through which they are intelligible, that the foundations on which human rights are based must allow for a plurality of philosophical, religious, and cultural worldviews, and that the universalism which is claimed is a universalism that can only be articulated and confirmed through multiple, inclusive, tradition-thick, cross-cultural conversations. When situated within this epistemological framework, human rights is understood to be a form of situated knowledge and a particular manifestation of an embedded universalism. So human rights norms, then, are better understood in terms of being particular or local expressions of universalist claims, which over time, and as a result of the persuasiveness of their appeal, have evolved into a global moral language. In fact, I'd suggest that in addition to being more credible philosophically, this characterization of human rights norms is also far more accurate historically. Indeed, the history of human rights displays the trajectory of its evolution from local to global very well. with a development process that has included first a declaration, then the appropriation and enculturation of an initial rights claim in a different cultural context, then the rearticulation of that original claim in a different form and often with a radically different emphasis. The transformation of human rights discourse from one that was dominated by a concern for individual liberty to a far more expansive one, which is also concerned with the economic, social, and cultural interests of individuals and communities, provides, I think, a good example of this trajectory, but it's not the only one. Through the 20th century, the traditional focus on individual liberty was gradually replaced by a broader account of human rights, encapsulated in the language of second and third generation rights. This process has involved defining new rights, as well as extending the conventional scope of the claimants of rights to include groups as well as individuals. So in this evolution, one can see the trajectory that human rights discourse has followed, emerging from a particular context, articulating a universalist claim, being adopted and appropriated by other situated communities who then developed it in ways unanticipated by the originators. The transformations, I would suggest, have been radical and organic, not superficial. The substantive issues raised by these transformations are not really of concern to me here. Rather, the purpose is to highlight how human rights discourse has evolved so that we have very often a Western expression of a core value, acquiring a degree of international standing, which then finds resonance with other contextual articulations of value, and through this interaction, not only forges consensus, but in the process transforms the original value itself. It's a form of situated knowledge, but insofar as it expresses a value that is believed to have global purchase, it is also an expression of an embedded universalism. It's a mistake, I would think, to characterize such expressions of value as merely local, since all expressions of value are ultimately local and contextual. They are, rather, contextual expressions of values in which are embedded universalist claims and aspirations. Moreover, they emerge from this interaction of multiple situated communities who, drawing on their own expressions of value, articulate claims they believe to have universal purchase. Human rights norms express the settled consensus as it is currently. Moreover, as we engage in deliberation on human rights claims, we aim for a consensus on the importance of certain values, all the time aware that this consensus building is shaped by the cultural and historical limitations of our moral languages and our moral traditions. So my argument here, I'm going to skip a few lines, is that if we think about the way in which traditional human rights theory has been conceptualized as a universalist language grounded in transcendent norms and apprehended through a form of abstract reasoning, I would suggest that this conceptualization is really flawed, not only because it misreads the philosophical nature of our moral knowledge, but also because it ignores the historical trajectory of human rights. What I want to suggest is a redescription of human rights discourse as situated knowledge and as embedded universalism allows us to think differently about how human rights are grounded, and in particular about the role that religious and other communities can play in the advancement of human rights. Let me move on then, having made that case, I hope, to talk about the role of religion, but taking what I would describe as a genealogical perspective on religion. The continued growth in religious affiliation, when combined with increasing religious diversity and the repoliticization of the religious and moral sphere, creates a new and renewed opportunities for religious traditions to engage in and with the politics of human rights, as well as new challenges for human rights politics as it engages with discrete, often transnational, politically engaged religious communities. When I consider the role that religious and other communities can play in the advancement of human rights, I want to challenge and address what I consider to be a limitation of many contemporary discussions about the role of religion in the politics of human rights. Namely, the fact that in these discussions, religious communities and traditions are often essentialized and idealized. In fact, I would suggest we need an understanding of religion in which its internal diversity is foregrounded, an approach to community and religious community that recognizes that it adapts to the hybridity of contemporary belonging, and also an account of religious tradition that is mindful of its evolving and dynamic character. And so when I would suggest one deconstructs the stereotypes of bounded communities and fixed traditions that tend to shape the conversations about religion and human rights, then the shape of the conversation about the role of religion in the advancement of human rights politics can proceed in a different key. I would like to, in that context, just say something very briefly about what the shape of contemporary religious belonging today. It is a very contested field, and of course we know a great deal about the nature of political religion. But when one looks at a lot of the academic discussion about religious communities in the context of human rights, one can see that this renewed focus on community tends to treat religious traditions as though they are bounded, in which social roles are fixed and uncontested, and in which belonging is singular. But as we know from a lot of the work on culture, the philosophy of culture, this concept of a unitary culture and singular belonging is highly problematic. And this is true also not only about cultural belonging, but also about religious belonging. And when one looks at a great deal of the work of religious scholars in this field, one can see that their work, whether it is in the context of Christianity in Africa or Asia, whether it looks at the way in which religious communities have been racialized across the Northern Hemisphere, one can see that the concepts of religious community are highly politically and racially charged, and they have really been transformed through the process of, in the context of modernity, through the processes of globalization and modernization. So contemporary ways of religious belonging really need to, I think, be fed into the discussion about the role of religious communities in the context of the advancement of human rights. Because not only because of the way in which religious belonging is changing, has been contested, the ways in which religious belonging is often dual and multiple, but also because of the way in which the boundaries between religious and secular contexts have really become far more porous. In the same way that we have recognized that in multi-ethnic societies, citizens and individuals really have hyphenated, as has been described, identities or multiple identities. So it is in relation to religious traditions and their engagement with the broader culture in which they function. Of course, there have always been significant points of intersection between religious and cultural communities through history, but the speed, intensity, and proximity of the exchange today has meant that such interaction is unavoidable, as unavoidable as it is constant. As Hans Ucko has commented, since most of the major religious traditions today have had the experience of being cultural hosts to other religious traditions and of being hosted by cultures shaped by religious traditions other than their own, Therefore, the identities of religious communities and of the individuals within them are never static, but they're always fluid and dynamic. And the boundaries between the communities are neither fixed nor solid, but rather are far more permeable than we might expect. So, in the same way as the contemporary social and political landscape has been irrevocably transformed by the changing shape of cultural belonging, so too it is the case with the religious landscape. And once politics, I think, can take account of the changed nature of religious belonging, then the nature of the conversation about the role of religious actors can be fundamentally altered. And by way of finishing, I would like to just mention one other aspect of this, which is similarly with the understanding of tradition. Indeed, the language of tradition, even more than that of community, tends to evoke images of static, unitary, and seamless inheritance. However, when one considers the history of traditions, whether they be religious or secular, one can see that they are the products of discursive processes and are the result of and as a result are historically constructed and internally diverse. The historian John Noonan characterizes, for example, the Catholic Church's moral tradition in this way. What was forbidden became lawful, the cases of usury and marriage. What was permissible became unlawful, the case of slavery. And what was required became forbidden, the persecution of heretics. So when one considers, as I said, for example, the Roman Catholic Church's tradition on marriage, on divorce, on abortion, on slavery, on conscientious objection to war, on religious freedom, and on human rights, one considers an always evolving, often inconsistent, and often contradictory body of thought. So this idea of religious moral traditions as being fixed and unchanging is really a fiction. And as you will know, although the Roman Catholic Church now uses the idiom of human rights consistently in its social and political ethics, there was a time when it too expressed hostility to the modern concept of human rights. So not only did Pius VI declare that it was anathema for Catholics to accept the 1798 Declaration of the Rights of Man, but also Morari Vos also strongly condemned liberalism, individualism, democracy, and freedom of conscience, speech, and the press. So initially deeply hostile to the concept, it has, over the centuries, enthusiastically embraced and appropriated the discourse. As this tradition of human rights demonstrates, when one brings a genealogical perspective to bear on moral and religious traditions, one discovers that previously unquestioned positions have frequently been abandoned and substantial innovations have occurred. Moreover, not only have the conclusions about morality of certain practices changed, but in addition, the ethical frame within which many practices are evaluated has also been transformed. Of course, it would be wrong to overstate the trajectory of change because it is as tradition that these evolve. Nonetheless, moral traditions are best understood as discursive traditions forged through this dynamic of continuity and change. And studies in comparative religious ethics confirm that a similar trajectory is evident in other religious traditions, and that the evolution and change are essential components of religious traditions, even when religious leaders prefer to downplay their significance. So viewed through a genealogical lens, one can see that each religious tradition is embedded in political processes that have involved choices between various interpretations of the community's history, power struggles over the authorization and legitimation of the community's traditions, disagreements about the criteria for belonging, and debates about where the power to define the limits of tradition resides. So religious traditions are frequently invoked to provide a bulwark against progress and change. But as I've argued, Simplistic appeals to religion as a means of impeding change are neither warranted nor defensible, since such appeals fail to acknowledge that religions themselves have changed and continue to change. So I would suggest that conversations and processes that aim at meaningful political exchange on the important and contentious issue of human rights ignore the constructedness of religious traditions at their peril. So really by conclusion, I would like to suggest that it's important that we give due recognition to the role that both history and politics have played in the construction of our current accounts of these categories, so that they feature in our working definitions of religious traditions. Doing so will allow the inherent dynamism of these categories to emerge and to be properly acknowledged. And this can be especially helpful in conversations about their role in the politics of human rights. Thank you.
Many thanks to Linda Hogan for her speech, in which she has argued for a redescription of human rights discourse through embedded universalism, and in which she has stressed the importance of focusing on religion and on the role played by religion, understood by the so-called genealogical perspective. So many thanks. And now the floor to Cohen the Fighter.
Okay.
And do you
Maybe we shall swap
yeah?
places. Yeah.
Should you?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to address you today, and my thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to do so. For a number of years now, our research group at the University of Antwerp, it's a law and development research group, has been involved in a research project that we've called Localizing Human Rights. And I wanted to start with giving you a bit of background to this work, which serves as an introduction to what we have learned from the project in terms of research methodologies. So the aim of our work was to track the life cycle of a human rights claim. And for that purpose, an anthropologist, in fact, developed this circle. And you have to start at the bottom of the circle to get an idea of the kind of questions we were asking. And we started with how do human rights claims emerge, right? Why do people decide that they want to make use of human rights language? And our assumption was that people would feel threatened in their human dignity, would have identified a threat, and then make a strategic decision to use human rights language or not. That is not a self-evident option in many parts of the world. So the first series of questions was around why do people claim human rights? And of course, even before that, perhaps, are questions about human rights awareness. Because if you're not aware of human rights, it's very hard to claim them. Then we looked at what sort of human rights claims are being made, who decides within a community, for instance, what claim will be made, because again, there are choices, and power relations within communities may decide, for instance, that human rights claims that relate to women are not made. But it's human rights claims that are of interest to whoever is dominant within that particular group. The next step then is, even if you make a human rights claim, you still have a choice on what sort of actions you will pursue. Will you go law? Will you go and litigate? Will you turn to courts? Will you go and sit on the streets and demonstrate? Will you go to a local administrator? Or will you turn to international institutions, right? Will you write a letter to UN Special Rapporteur on the rights that you are invoking? So that's all strategy. You go for law, you go for politics, you go for other ways of trying to make the claim. The next step, and then we're at the top of the circle, is what is the response? So then we look at the duty bearer side, if you like. Is that claim denied? Is it deemed irrelevant by the duty bearer, or is it accommodated in some way? And a duty bearer is traditionally in human rights the government, although that is maybe now changing. And a duty bearer is certainly not homogeneous, because it exists, there's different parts to the duty bearer. There's the judiciary, obviously, but there's also the executive and so on. And even ministries within the same government quite often have very different human rights approaches. And often the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the worst in terms of its sympathy for human rights claims, particularly if there's an international involvement. And then the other side of the circle is about external involvement, is about, because human rights are a global language, there's this promise that if you use that language, you might get external support from outside of the community. A strategic advantage of calling something a human rights violation is that you suddenly use a language that is understood by many more people. It's often better to talk about human rights than to say, well, we want secession or we as a minority want self-determination. It's better to talk, or sometimes strategically better to talk in human rights language, because you have this appeal to the broader community. But that doesn't mean that the support actually materializes in practice. And the support can be from global civil society organizations. Are you able to awake the interest of the Amnesty Internationals and the Human Rights Watchers of this world? Could be support by regional human rights mechanisms, could be the global infrastructure around human rights. And then finally in the circle there's also the question about whether all these local experiences of trying to claim human rights make any difference to how we do human rights globally. So whether it's not just the global feeding into the local, but whether the local can also somehow inspire and lead to developments at the global level. And in a way, I think the circle is sort of, at the same time, almost an ideal scenario, right? I mean, if human rights would really work, they might work because this network that is suggested by the circle actually materializes. And so our research was about the factors that determine whether the use of human rights actually leads to results. Whether, if the aim is to claim human rights to improve human dignity, what factors impede that result, or what factors facilitate that result. So in our research, we were observing, right? We were not promoting human rights, right? And we were certainly not arguing that we were defending human rights through our research. We wanted to objectively, critically also observe to what extent human rights actually work in local circumstances. And we were particularly interested in claims made by marginalized groups, by the people that are left behind, by the ones that within their own society are in a difficult position, also locally. So in our methodology, we focused on the rights holders, right? And I acknowledge that you can also do a multi-stakeholder analysis and still focus on marginalized people. So we could have said, you know, we talk to NGOs, we talk to the duty bearers, we talk to the UN, and so on and so on. But in our research, we really wanted to focus primarily on the people that face the threat, right? And that is not as I will explain, is not an innocent choice. It's certainly, I'm a lawyer by training. It's certainly not self-evident in a law-oriented research to use as the main source of information the knowledge of people that are illiterate and that have never heard about international human rights law at all. In none of the studies that we did in the field did people know anything about what international human rights treaties said. So it's not self-evident in law-oriented research to use that kind of knowledge, because in law we tend to use sources that are written and are produced by legal professionals, such as the treaty drafters or the legislators or judges or other people that wear gowns. So our interpretive community, and this is a term from Stanley Fish, our interpretive community of human rights consists mostly of legal professionals. They are entitled to give meaning to the concept of human rights. And to determine then that the knowledge of illiterate people on the use of human rights is also scientific knowledge, was, I think, a crucial starting point from the research that we did, to value the knowledge on the use of human rights by people that actually face the threat, and to turn that into scientifically relevant knowledge, not knowledge that is considered to be irrelevant from a scientific point of view. And I think this approach connects in a way to two strands. One is sort of the strands on the so this idea of rethinking ownership of human rights, I think, fits both in a decolonial approach and perhaps also in approach on global citizenship. So in a decolonial approach, and that's an approach that's been drafted mostly in country by researchers from the global south, there's the starting point is that no culture in the world has remained untouched by European modernity, right? And perhaps human rights are also an element of those ideas of European modernity. But if you want to decolonize that knowledge, we have to redefine that emancipatory logic or rhetoric of modernity from the point of view, and I quote, of the cosmologies and epistemologies of the subaltern, the people, the marginalized people. Moving, again I quote, moving to a decolonial universal requires respecting the multiple local particularities in the struggles against patriarchy, coloniality, and Eurocentric modernity. And this is a quote from Ramon Gros-Foguel. And then in the words of another author, who I admired both as a scholar and as a person, and I apologize, I cannot do this in Antonio's voice or imitate his tone. This is quote, "The international legal recognition of human rights obliges us to reconstruct citizenship, starting not from state institutions, but from its original holder, the human being, with his or her inherent rights internationally recognized. We are legitimized," writes Antonio, "to think new by Article 7 of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. That states that everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to develop and discuss new human rights, ideas and principles, and to advocate their acceptance. New citizenship, he argues, in tandem with the impact of the necessary intercultural dialogue aimed at democratic inclusion, can revitalize the public sphere in a perspective of multi-level and supranational governance." So maybe by focusing on the local, we can also reinvent the global, or at least the local can help us think about the global. And this is an idea that is not unique to human rights. In development studies, we know the concept of place-based development, the recognition that global processes are always modified by the matrix of place. So local meanings of human rights do not necessarily coincide with their meaning in international human rights treaties. But these local understandings grow out of real local human rights needs. And so we can also use those local understandings constructively. The issue that is raised is whether it's possible to capitalize on the experience of those local actors with a view to improving the effectiveness of global human rights in providing human dignity. Local people can develop human rights. And their ideas should be discussed interculturally and then be responded to at various levels of governance. So I will now embark on something that's a little counterintuitive to a lawyer, and instead of discussing our substantive findings on the use of human rights, share our experiences with engaging in local human rights fieldwork, and particularly focus on the relationship between the respondents in our research, the rights holders, the ones left behind, and the research team in the research that we did. Okay, so these are the case studies that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. The methodology we used was socio-legal research, carried out always in partnership with local universities in India, China, and the DRC. These local universities suggested the specific research topic. So they chose the right to education or the right to water and sanitation as their preferred topic that they wanted to work in. We used qualitative research, mostly semi-structured interviews, primarily of local groups claiming human rights, complemented with a limited number of interviews of other stakeholders. And then the material from those interviews was combined with desk studies on the law at the global, national, and local levels. We also decided that we would publish all our research results in open access, right? So all these studies, well, apart from the last one, which will appear in a few weeks' time, are available from the website of the research group in open access. And when I'm discussing methodology and experience, I must admit that we learned by doing. And that in a way, our team discovered the literature on research methodology as we went along. So what follows is not only about what we did, but also about what we could have done better, or should perhaps have done better than we did, right? And discovered that we weren't prepared for many of the questions that emerged during our research. So this is, I think, recent literature that I would certainly recommend if you are yourself engaged in human rights research at the local level. There's a new research methods book done by Edward Elgar. And then a book that I've also recently discovered is a book by Canadian and American scholars on community-based research in rural villages in Canada and the United States. So a very different area of the world than the one that I was working in, but still I think many relevant findings in there as well. So I think the first set of questions is about the composition of the research team. In law, we tend to not talk about who we are, who I am when I'm writing, or where we come from as a research team in relationship to the respondents, right? So for instance, to give you a bit of background, my father was a colonial civil servant in the Congo. And I was conceived in the Congo. But born in Belgium because I was conceived in 1960, and in 1960 the Congo became independent and my parents had to flee because of during the independence struggle. First my mother, and then a few months later my father. Okay. So, one of our projects is in the DRC, in the Congo. That's the former colony of Belgium, right? If you go to the Congo as a Belgian research team, it's a very different experience from going to India. You know, in India, I don't bear the burden of history. I'm a European researcher, which may still be problematic to some certain extent, but at least I'm not a former colonial power, right? If you go as a Belgian research team into the Congo, there are all sorts of expectations, also and perceptions about the historical role of Belgians in the Congo. And this is one of the reasons why for years I really didn't want to enter into research on the Congo, because it's a much more complicated relationship than when I do research on China, for instance, or on India. But that's only one example. So I think it's important to reflect about who you are, about your own history, and what that history means for your human rights research, and for the choices you make in terms of the topics you want to research on, and in terms of the countries that you want to go to. For many people, the personal history is really, and some transparency about the personal history is important to understand the research that these people are engaging in. So I think it's good to be transparent about that. The second big question that we had, and we used both models, is whether you go for immersion into the communities, which is sort of the anthropological approach, right? Where you say you go and sit in a rural village in the Congo and you stay there for months. Or whether you go for working with a big group of students from a university that go into a slum in New Delhi with a semi-structured questionnaire. And I think both methodologies have their advantages and their disadvantages, and I think maybe later in the conference we can take up what works best. Of course, if you go in with a team of people, if you do it with students, I think from an academic point of view, it's actually very interesting to do that almost by way of a legal clinic. If you do that with a group of students, training is really, really important, because if you're not working with a group of experienced interviewers, then there's also all sorts of risks that you run. So what we tended to do, and we worked in China and in India, we worked with students, was to start off with a big training seminar, and with mock interviews, and you start with interviews that that will not be part of the final research, just trial by trial and error, also to test the questionnaires. The problem of transcending disciplinary boundaries, social legal research means that you're using two disciplines, the social sciences and law, and you need at least a minimal understanding of the other discipline to be able to do it. Also within a team, it requires quite some time to understand, to learn to understand each other. You know, just to give you, again, a practical example, so we used the in vivo methodology for assembling and categorizing the data. That's a social science methodology. On the other hand, we were also looking at the relationship between international human rights law and the Indian constitution and how that impacted on domestic law. And we had people in our research team that knew a lot about in vivo and nothing at all about the implementation of international human rights law and the other way around. And so if you want to bring data together that are based from both these disciplines, it's to develop a dialogue within a team, and an understanding within a team takes time and patience and a willingness to do it and a willingness to learn from the other discipline, which is not always a given. And it even becomes even more complicated in a cross-cultural setting, because then it's also about, you know, working with Congolese researchers is very different from working with Indian researchers, from working with Chinese researchers, and that intercultural dialogue, I think, is also time-consuming. I think it's tremendously important, right? If you go and do research in another culture than your own, to work together with people from that culture. I think even from a perspective of the universality of human rights. I mean, if we believe in universality of human rights, then we should be able, in our own research, to work interculturally on human rights issues and to avoid imposing a specific view on human rights on our counterparts. And so I think this notion of an intercultural dialogue within human rights research actually can be a modest contribution to the broader intercultural dialogue that we need to really establish universality. Okay. Of course, at the beginning of the research, it's crucial to think very carefully about which community or which group of people you will be researching. And it's very hard to say, well, let me give you the example from India. So we were going to do the right to water and sanitation in slums in New Delhi. And we ended up doing 4 different slums in the same city. Which slums, right? What slums, and how do you get access to these people? I think, of course, it's easier if you can build on an existing relationship. If there's already a tradition of, if colleagues have gone before you, and that there's also already an awareness of who you are as an institution, for instance, when you go in. But if that doesn't exist, then usually you rely on gatekeepers, as the literature calls them. And gatekeepers are people that are going to help you in getting access to a local community. Very often, that will be NGOs, for instance. NGOs that work, for instance, in the slums, and that tell you, well, I have good contacts there, I can help you in getting access. It's a very, very tricky thing, because the gatekeeper also, particularly if that gatekeeper has an activity in the slum, is in fact perhaps also partially an object of your research, right? And we may think of NGOs as positive forces, and I'm happy with assuming that as a starting point. But these gatekeepers have a history in the site location. And so if you have to rely on a gatekeeper, I think it's crucial to reflect on the impact of having done that on the findings of your research. And again, to be as transparent as possible about it. If you want to work closely with the community, and you want to immerse and so become to some extent part of what they are, the difficulty may arise that from a human rights perspective, you're also very much interested in power relationships within the community. And so it may not be easy to keep a good understanding with that community once you delve into issues of discrimination within the community, right? If you go into an indigenous community, for instance, and you want to raise problems about women's rights, and you're faced with the leadership of the community that is entirely male, which is often, well, not always, but often the case in indigenous communities, and then you want to be part of the community and share their lives, but it's very difficult to do that while at the same time questioning some of the power structures in the community, and you have to, if your interest is in discovering the use of human rights within the community. Also, I think what we've encountered is that poor people are very busy, right? They're busy with surviving. So they don't necessarily have much time to talk to you, to talk to a researcher. And so even if you're very sympathetic and ethically inspired, and to say, well, from a perspective of unearthing the knowledge, you may face a lot of difficulties in getting people to find the time. And I think, again, there's a balance to be struck between, the data that you need to assemble. And so, of course, we would love long interviews, 1 hour interviews. If you do a semi-structured interviews, they should be long. But on the other hand, these are people that have to go and fetch water or that have to go and work. And so there are compromises in terms of the amount of time that people will be willing to give you. And again, there are language barriers. One of the biggest difficulties that we faced was if you want to investigate the use of human rights, that the term human rights doesn't exist in the language of the people that you're talking to, right? So that's a problem, because in a way you don't want to ask questions about human rights. You don't want to bring in the term human rights into a conversation if your purpose is, for instance, to investigate whether there is a local concept that is akin to human rights, or that is close to human rights, or a sort of an equivalent in a tradition or in a philosophical, in a philosophy or a religion that is very close to human rights. So we took great care to avoid the term human rights as much as possible until the later stages of the interview. Because if you start with introducing the term human rights, you're in a way already messing up the data that you will receive. If there is no equivalent in the local language of the term human rights. Okay, let me just check the time. I'll skip all the problems that arise during the actual research, and there are many, because in and these problems are about, and they've been written about a lot, are about not causing harm to the people that you interview, right? If you're going to do an investigation about sexual violence, and you're going to interview women that possibly face domestic violence by their husbands, what happens to them after they've given the interview? If these husbands actually beat them, right? And so what is you have a responsibility as a researcher to ensure that you're not endangering people by interviewing them. And so you'll see that a number of UN agencies have developed standards on how to avoid causing direct harm to the people that you're interviewing, because you are leaving, right? You will no longer be there after a while, but the people may not have that choice. Issues about informed consent, obviously, right? To be very clear about what you are using the research for, whether they, so that they can make an informed decision on whether they want to talk to you or not. The use of photographic material. I mean, on the cover of the India study, there are no people, because we weren't sure that we had the agreement of the people that we have many photographs of people living in the slums, but we didn't use it on the cover because we weren't sure whether we had their consent. And then also, of course, typical questions of professional conduct in terms of scientific research. But I want to turn to sharing benefits, because this comes up always, right? So you go into, as a researcher, you go and do human rights research, and then they ask you, why should I talk to you? Are you going to help me, right? What is in it for me? Why should I do that? What are the benefits for the people that you've interviewed, right? And so one thing I've learned is not to raise expectations, right? Not to say, this research will empower you, because probably it will not, right? Probably you're collecting information and you will publish this information, but whether that research will have an impact on the community afterwards, don't promise things on which you cannot deliver. So do not raise expectations about the effects of the research that you do. Sharing findings, what happens to the outcome? There's an article that I've quoted in the paper that covers this, and it's called "Stealing Our Stories." Yeah? These are people that say, well, who owns the intellectual property rights on the knowledge that you've acquired from the research? Whose knowledge is it? It's the community's knowledge, right? So, but you are publishing. So you're reaping the benefits in an academic career, for instance. You publish with Cambridge University Press, right? But it's actually their knowledge, right? So try to get an agreement, I think, on who owns the knowledge and on the use that you can make of the knowledge. Can the people or the community that you have interviewed, can they co-decide on the publication of the results? Do they have a say in whether these results get published or not? Or is that the province of the academic that has gone to interview them? There is a whole literature about benefits that can be negotiated with communities at the start of a research project. The only problem with doing that is that it has to be in your budget, and that you have to find a funder, a funding agency that is willing to include these kind of things in the budget, because they're not directly linked to the research, right? You can offer training as a researcher on knowledge mobilization. You can ask a community what would help you. In return for the time they give you, you can give help training in critical thinking. You could enable connections to other local groups that are in a similar position as the community that you're interviewing, and saying, we will help you in doing that, to strengthen their lobbying position within their own society. So the answer to all of this is that maybe if you're doing research, human rights research, you need a research protocol, between the local group and the research team at the start, where you clarify a number of these issues, right? So that you negotiate with the group rather than simply go in and do it. Of course, you can go further, right? As I said, in our research, we were not defending human rights or promoting human rights, or we were looking critically at whether human rights worked or not. There is, in the literature, there are other approaches, right? And that maybe also talks to our final plenary session, where you say, well, we go for action research. We actually, as a researcher, go one step further, and we put ourselves at the service of the community. And there's this distinction that can be made between community-based research and participatory action research, and the latter is somewhat more confrontational and more even more politically engaged, I think. But the bottom line is that if in an action or a community-based research, you do not define the research problem, right? You go and ask the community what research they would be interested in. So you don't, at your own university, decide that you're going to do research on A, B, and C. You go into a community and you ask them what is research that is useful for you, right? And then in the whole process, the community becomes a partner in the research process up until the end. And then, of course, you have to take joint decisions on publication and so on. So we didn't do this in our own research. This is not something that we engaged in. But what we did face towards the end of our research was a human rights emergency. And I must admit that we weren't fully prepared for that to happen. So this was one of the 4 slums in New Delhi. We were doing our research. It was at the end of the research process, luckily. Actually, a visit some months after we had done the formal social survey. So in one of these 4 slums, there was a demolition, a partial demolition of the slum, while the research team was on site. Right? So we were there. Now, we had said we are observers. Eh? We want to see how human rights are used. But we knew the people. And they were all there with their mobile phones, making films of the police action. This was an unannounced demolition, no consultative process in advance, houses being demolished with everything in them, protests by the slum dwellers, police violence against some of the women that were throwing stones at the police, counteracting the action of the police. And they said, and the people said, told us, help us, right? And we didn't have a protocol. So we didn't have we hadn't thought about that in advance, about what will we do? And because in our research design, we were not supposed to intervene. We were supposed to see what happened, right? And the researchers that were there at the time decided that ethically they could not stand aside, right? That even if this didn't fit within our research design, that there was no way that they could be passive. And so what did they do? They alerted one of the main NGOs that had helped us as a gatekeeper originally to get into the slums and told them, this is happening. They didn't know yet that was happening. And they also put one of these films that was made by the slum dwellers on YouTube. That upset me. The second thing upset me a little bit because I thought, well, we as a researcher, that's perhaps one step too far. Right? I was back in Belgium at the time when this happened. And so we decided quickly, we improvised and said, we should not as researchers become an active participant, but we can assist We can assist an NGO, for instance, and we can do things under the cover of an NGO, right? The next thing that the NGO suggested was that a letter should be sent to the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, who had just visited India a few months before, and her report hadn't yet been published, right? So one of our researchers ended up writing a communication to the an urgent communication, an urgent action request to the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing. Now again, that messed up our research design, because one of the things we are researching is about the role of UN Special Rapporteurs and whether their activities actually make any difference to the situation. So again, I think, from a research design perspective, it was a problematic thing to do. In the end, the Special Rapporteur ended up writing a letter to the government of India about the case, and you can reconstruct that now from UN documents. What we've done is write about it in the report and acknowledge that this wasn't planned for, that we weren't prepared, and that we improvised and did the best we could, and leave it to the reader whether, to what extent, what we did jeopardized our original research design. The better solution would have been to think about it in advance, right? And to be ready, particularly if you're investigating situations like refugee. I know one of the papers is about refugee camps, and there's bound to be difficulties where you, as a researcher, end up in a situation where actually human rights violations are occurring while you are there. And it's better, I think, to have a clear understanding before you go in and clear rules within the team on how to do it than to improvise in the way that we did. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Cohen the Fater for having explained us how to describe the use of the local use of human rights, and for having stressed some very basic and crucial issues in order to design a research, in order to conduct a research on this local use of human rights. I think we have lots of issues and points of view and perspectives also on which to base our discussion now. So I officially open the discussion. So feel free to intervene, to ask questions to our speakers.
Thank you. Good morning, I'm Pietro De Perini. I am a research fellow here at the University of Padua Human Rights Center. I would like to thank the three of you for these three fascinating speeches, which I believe brought a step forward a complex debate on challenges and opportunity of human rights research. I have one question for now, and I would like to address it to Professor Landman. I've noticed that you describe your rigorous morality approach as transdisciplinary. So, there is also a big debate and some lack of clarity concerning terms. So I wonder if you're using transdisciplinary as a synonym with other similar terms such as interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, or if not, how your approach differ from these approaches. Thank you.
Probably most synonymous with interdisciplinarity. I think the field started talking about multidisciplinarity, that we're multiple disciplines looking at the same problem. Interdisciplinarity tried to say, well, what do you learn from each discipline that helps you understand the problem? I think the transdisciplinary argument tries to go a little step further. And one of the things we're trying to do is bring in disciplines that hadn't typically spoken to human rights before. When I went to Nottingham, there was a geospatial institute and a school of geography. And the two units hadn't really spoken to each other in a number of years. And I was really interested in what the engineers could tell the geographers and vice versa. And when I went to the Geospatial Institute, I said, well, what do you guys do? And they said, we're involved in Earth observation. I said, what's that? And they said, well, you know, we look for rivers and silt and mountains and forests and all those sorts of things. I said, have you ever looked at people? Oh, no, we don't do that. So I found that absolutely extraordinary that a group of engineers who have the eye in the sky, if you will, weren't looking at people. And I said, well, it's really amazing. You can spend a lot of your resource just looking at refugee flows and migrants and sites of conflict, etc. And interestingly, he said that he was a member of a 100-country coalition of Earth observation experts that meet in Europe on a regular basis, and not one of those country teams had ever looked at people. And I just find that extraordinary. So I guess what we're trying to do is transcend some of the silos within disciplines and to open up conversations into disciplines that hadn't typically looked at human rights problems. And interestingly, the one Associate Professor Doreen Boyd has spent her whole life on remote sensing and geospatial techniques, has now found a new pathway within her career on precisely using satellite technology to document and look at slavery problems. So I guess in that sense, that transcending the silos is what we're trying to develop in this notion of transdisciplinarity.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the three keynote speakers for their very interesting and inspiring speeches. My name is Desiree Campagna. I'm a PhD candidate. I would like to address to Professor Landman a very short question regarding your graph on the methodological trade-off, which I found really interesting. How do you assess the mixed methods research designs according to this methodological trade-off? So my question is, are mixed methods research design useful in addressing some methodological trade-off, and why? And I have another short question for Professor De Feiter. So thank you for your very interesting insights on the field work. And my question is, as researcher, we are always very biased by our own theoretical background, our own hypothesis. So how we can be sure that we are not manipulating local knowledge, and how it is possible to address this challenge within the work of the research team? So maybe analyzing the interview in a cross manner or exchanging insights. How do you deal with this? Thank you so much.
Okay, I will do it in the order of the questions. So very quickly, the trade-offs are there and are often reliant on the question you're asking. So if you're asking a very locally specific question, then the method, in a sense, is defined for you. So if you're worried about landless people in Brazil, then you go to an area where there are landless people in Brazil struggling against landowners, right? If you're interested in the right to land and the exploitation of land, or the concentration of land and how it affects conflict, then you're specifying a question of a much more general nature, and it might be that you do something like a large N comparative study. What I'm trying to argue, though, is that both are necessary. So if you're going to go do land struggle in Brazil, you ought to read all the literature on land inequality in the global sense as well, because it informs the sorts of questions you might ask at the local level. And in that sense, you can transcend some of that methodological trade-off, as it were. And I had a student who was Italian, actually, Marco Larizza, who was interested in what he called a democratic performance gap. And he did a large N study of that quantitatively. He then did a regional quantitative study of Latin America and then a single case study of Venezuela. And so in that sense, he had a mixed method approach, which used both the insights from large N quantitative research to small N and single N qualitative research. And I think that that's a really healthy conversation. For a PhD student, it's really hard because you need to master much of the literature and you need to master many of the methods at the same time. So it can actually be hugely challenging for a student to do that. I have seen multiple researcher projects where you have your quantitative experts and your qualitative experts. And I thought it was interesting what Kunde was talking about in terms of his en vivo people versus the others. And so a lot of the work on truth commissions, for example, you see there are qualitative research teams doing deep estudios en profundidad, which is what was used in Peru, alongside statisticians counting dead people, right? And those two communities don't often talk to each other, but if they do, the insights from that conversation is very, very healthy for understanding a problem in a more holistic fashion.
Yeah, the problem of bias of the researcher. Again, on the one hand, I think one part of the solution is transparency and acknowledgement of your own position, for instance, vis-à-vis the community that you are researching. Of course, there are social science techniques for comparing data and coding them and then objectifying, if you like, subjective positions that are given by individual interviewees. I also think that working in a team helps, and working particularly in an interdisciplinary team actually helps you discover your own bias, both from a disciplinary perspective and from perhaps a political perspective or a specific understanding of human rights that you have. And in an intercultural context, that's even more interesting, I think, because it makes you aware of things that you take for granted, right? And it's true, as Todd says, that as an individual researcher, it's a very, very complicated exercise to do on your own. So maybe we are saying that if you want to engage in local human rights research or research fieldwork, that it's better to do it in a team.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm Azadeh Dastiari from Monash University's Caston Centre for Human Rights Law all the way in Australia. I was very interested, Professor Landman, in that image that you had of all the incredible collaborations you have managed to bring about. In our centre we've tried to do that with various degrees of success, so I'm really interested to hear what were the practical steps that you took to ensure there's okay communication between the disciplines? As was raised before, that can be really difficult. And the biggest stumbling block that we have found is when it comes to actual publication. So people are very happy to talk to each other, they have wonderful ideas, but when it comes to the crux of it, actually sitting down and publishing something together, that's where a lot of those methodological issues come about, and also journals as gatekeepers who don't necessarily encourage interdisciplinary work. Just what practical steps did you take? Thank you.
So the first practical step we took is the university opened up an expression of interest in a competition, and the competition was for precious resource. So using my rationalist head, there were a set of incentives for people to work together. It was a very simple kind of, if you work, there will be support for your work. Secondly, we devised a program that supports our researchers, not by bombing in superstars into our university, but supporting the people we already have with research assistants and teaching assistants to provide them the time that they require to work on new projects. So there was a real kind of material, or I should say a kind of instrumental way of thinking about how do you incentivize an academic to work with another academic. So that was problem one. And not everyone wanted to do that. And those who didn't want to do that were not in the project. So it was quite simply going around and seeing who was willing to participate. And across that group of people, we found 14 major project leads that each have about 6 to 10 people in each of the projects, which gets us to 125 academics. And they are drawn from different disciplines, but they're focused on the same problem, which is modern slavery. Whether at the local level or at the global level, there's a commitment to understanding what it is and how we're going to help fight it. The other thing about the UK research context is that we have a research excellence framework which counts and scores the number of academic publications by university to distribute money. So again, there's another material incentive behind people publishing, and now the rules have changed, so there's been a decoupling of the academic from the output, which is to say that schools are now preparing submissions for this process in 2021 based on a total number of publications, and not necessarily 4 publications per person, which is what had worked before. So it's now a total number of publications based on the size of the staff base and an algorithm. And that has changed the field completely in terms of who you're going to work with and how, because you can count things in different ways. And then finally, in terms of, I think your intellectual question was about how do you get different disciplines together to publish in different journals. And this is a huge problem for human rights research. So my own sort of experience of this, publishing in Human Rights Quarterly, the Human Rights Journal, Journal of Human Rights, International Human Rights, Netherlands Quarterly of Human Rights, etc., was great for human rights progress, but not so good if you're a political scientist being judged by your peers. So there was a tricky balance finding venues to publish. So I managed to publish in International Studies Quarterly, but I can't tell you the number of times a journal article had been rejected because somebody said this is too normative for political science, right? And I think we've made a lot of strides to convince the profession of political science that normativity is okay. And that was evidenced by submitting this piece, Rigorous Morality, to the British Journal of Political Science, and they said, we know this already, this isn't anything new. And I thought, well, for 30 years you've been telling me not to do this, so I find it really interesting that you now say that we know how to do this and this is nothing new. So I think there's been some progress in journal editorship around the willingness to look at interdisciplinarity. Equally, the final point is that the government sources of money are now saying, unless it's interdisciplinary, we're not going to fund it. So there's actually a bit of turn in our research councils and in our Global Challenge Research Fund allocations in the UK government that have actually encouraged interdisciplinarity and partnership working with overseas development countries. So unless you have ODA partners, they're not going to fund you. And unless you're interdisciplinary, they're not going to fund you. Now, I think this is a very, very fecund space for human rights research because it's so fantastic that we can work with people we already know around the world and we can work across the disciplines to do our work.
Okay, my name is Olga Breska, I'm a PhD candidate. My question is to Professor Linda Hogan. I would like to thank Professor for problematizing the relationship between the concepts belonging, political religion, community, and human rights universalism, and engaging human rights with sociology of religion and political studies. My question is, if we do consider belonging and affiliation as a weak and fluid concept, how community could be seen as a significant factor which affects human rights? To my mind, belonging is critical for engagement with community activism and values. So my question is, how should we understand community from, or conceptualize community in other terms then? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just make sure I understood your question. How can we conceptualize religious community in terms other than that which it has been conceptualized up to now? Is that?
Which are different from belonging and affiliation with community, because you emphasize that community could be the other concept which could work and affect better. So I'm asking, what could be the other meanings of this concept?
Thank you. Yes, so moving away from this concept of belonging. Yep. So really, I suppose what I don't really want to argue that one needs to move away from the concept of belonging, but rather that one needs to problematize what belonging entails today. So that, especially when one looks at the way in which I think a great deal of human rights politics engages with religious communities, it assumes this sort of strong attachment to one's religious tradition, strong affiliations with the individuals within that community, and hard borders between the religious community, belonging to the religious community, and the broader political and civil context. And really what I was arguing is that in each of those cases, that is an incorrect characterization of how sort of lives tend to be lived in religious communities. So it's not so much that I want to challenge the concept of belonging, but rather to say that it entails many different layers. It involves multiple relationships inside and outside the community, and also, indeed, that the that very often relationships outside of the community are far stronger, far more meaningful, and far more dynamic than those within. So that's really what I want to stress. It's, as I say, to challenge the way in which belonging tends to be characterized. The other thing that I think is also important to stress is, particularly in the Western world, but not only, is that well, actually not at all, is that this idea of attachment to one particular religious tradition is not necessarily really accurate either. There are very large numbers of people who move between religious traditions, who are attached to a particular tradition for one phase of their lives and then move to others. And also many who are the phenomenon of double belonging, so affiliations with strong affiliation with more than one religious tradition. So all of this, I think, changes the way in which individuals within religious communities engage with human rights politics, and that's really what I wanted to stress.
Thank you. Elaine Webster from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, a former student of Professor De Fater on the Venice programme. Thank you all for your presentations. I wanted to ask a question about human rights values, in particular to Professor De Fater and Professor Hogan. It seemed that you both shared a perspective on the local embeddedness of human rights knowledge, and the idea that locally situated communities were valid sources of human rights claims and human rights understandings. And I wonder to what extent human rights values are important in that process. I'm thinking in particular of human dignity and equality. To what extent are those values a central part of engaging with local communities, as opposed to talking about legal standards? To what extent are the values important, either when you explicitly use the language of human rights or not, in the examples that Professor De Fater was giving? And if they are important, what are the benefits and or challenges of engaging at the level of values?
Thank you. Well, let me begin. Actually, it's an interesting question, and I also had a question for Con on this matter too, but maybe I'll ask that as I finish my comment. I think human rights values, as you've described them, are absolutely vital. Because, as you said, very often the language of human rights is not necessarily present, or even if it is, it's not necessarily the language that people immediately choose to use. So language of human dignity, equality, etc., I think that language is very important. I think what I would want to stress, however, is that it's very easy with the kind of characterization I gave to assume that anything that comes from an indigenous and local community is itself something to be valued and prized and not to be challenged. And I think by using the language of human rights values or using the language of individual dignity or equality, one has a language with which to also facilitate a criticism, a critique of local tradition, local custom, etc. Because at least for me, human rights really do entail ethical commitments that where certain things are indeed acceptable and others are not. So one has to have the vehicle for challenge and evaluation and criticism. And that locally embedded language is often far more resonant than a language that may not be sort of the currency of the context itself. My question related to that was really, if the language of human rights isn't used, when do you determine that it is a human rights claim? So it's a sort of a similar theme.
Yeah. So for the purposes of our research, we used a definition or a concept of human rights that consisted of three things. Right? That people would call it a right, that they would identify a duty bearer, something that's responsible, and that there was some sense of a requirement of accountability vis-à-vis that duty holder. And that if those three things were there, that meant that it was human rights for the purposes of our research, right? Now, one of the things we tried to discover within the communities was whether there was a human rights concept there. And we had two hypotheses. Either that concept was there because it had been inserted into the community from the outside. You have a human rights NGO who works in the slums and tells people about the Indian Constitution or the international human rights law. So the awareness of human rights comes from the network, from the fact it wasn't originally there, but it's brought in. Or there is an indigenous human rights concept, a concept that is within the group that is not inspired by international human rights law or by constitutional law. And then we reverted to this notion of, right, duty bearer, some sense of accountability. In the three cases that we investigated, I think in perhaps the best case, if you like, was in India, because there people talk about a concept they call HAQ, H-A-Q. We have a HAQ to water and sanitation. And they know that concept. Very few people, well, nobody knows the international human rights law. Some people know the Indian Constitution, right? But they have a HAQ. So the question was, is that HAQ to water and sanitation the same thing? Or does it correspond to this idea of I have a right, there's a duty bearer, and now there's literature about HAQ that exists, and it's actually a cosmopolitan concept. It's a concept that has traveled. So it's not specifically Indian, because it's a word from Urdu. Even in Hebrew, there's a precedent of the word. So it's a word that, through the context between different societies, has traveled from the Middle East over Northern Africa into India. So it's actually quite interesting, because it's similar in that sense to human rights, that it's not a purely local idea. When they explain, the people in the slums, what does it mean? They say, well, I have a right to water and sanitation, to drinking water and sanitation, because I'm a human being and the government must supply it. That's there, right? And it doesn't come from international human rights law. It's there. And some people would say, well, and it's because we participate in elections, right? So we vote, and so in return, the government has the obligation to provide water and sanitation. What is the issue? The issue is that the slums are, the people that live there have no property rights. So there are no rights of tenure or property, so they're not allowed to live there. And so the government will sometimes say, we will not supply water and sanitation because the settlement is illegal, right? They argue that is wrong because we are human beings, and it's from the fact that we are humans that's the origin of the government's obligation to provide for us. So that comes close, I think, to a human rights concept. The weaker thing in that is the accountability. Is there this notion that the government is then also accountable to these people? And there the reality is, but that takes us into the substantive findings of the research, that what they do is bargain rather than rely on rights claiming. So there's these patronage relationships that occur and that bring short-term benefits. So they will only actually hold the government accountable in crisis situations. Like when there's a demolition, then they will go to the judge, and then there's NGOs and public interest litigation lawyers that will help you. And so then you get actual human rights claiming. But to solve the everyday problems, they will strike bargains with local politicians and not use rights. And the politicians will be ready to strike a bargain during election time. So the actual use of accountability is